Getting started with using CSS for layout is a confusing but exciting journey. So, a couple things to think about on this is we have different tools at our disposal now. So in the past, we would need to really learn or understand what layout meant with CSS. And learnlayout.com is a great resource. We can wander our way through this and go and see. So if we don't have any layout on the site, line length just goes the entire width of the screen. That's kind of ugly, hard to read. So we need to start thinking about how you can do that. The difference is understanding that some elements in your markup will display inherently as block, like paragraph, 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 or headlines. These kinds of things are block level elements. Others are inline elements. We can frame them with a span tag, so each character, one after another inside a paragraph or headline, that would be an inline element. Images are inline elements unless you change their display property, and that's really what this is about, is understanding how you can change the property of something through CSS. So you can take and set its display property from its native block to make it become an inline element and see how that changes what happens on screen. So I've made a simple document where I have 3 paragraphs in it. Those paragraphs then have a width property set on them so that they are a little bit skinnier on screen. So I've set their width to 600. If we just get rid of that and we look at it, we can see the paragraphs just span the width of the screen. If my document is narrower, we can see we get line wrapping happening with that. So, all right, there we go. Now I can change this. So if I bring it back and we can see, okay, now they're width of 600. If I go and change their display property, and this is really what it's about, if I change the display property, suddenly they're no longer a block. When they're not a block, they don't have a width, because inline elements are just like each individual character in this paragraph. They just follow or flow in line. So different elements in HTML markup have different inherent display properties, but all of these can be overridden through the CSS. And that's really what I want you to grasp, is that the CSS allows you to take control of how your document displays on screen so that you can build the layout of your dreams. Now, I've added an unordered list to my document here, so let's save that and see. So we can see it puts those list items, each has a bullet on it. We commonly use unordered lists as a way to build navigation on our web pages when we're constructing them from scratch. Just a side note, I am using the wildcard selector, the asterisk or star sign, to select everything on the page and put a border on it, just so I can see where the boundaries of each individual item occurs on my page. Now going into the CSS, if I go into my unordered list and style it, I will go into my list style and I will choose none for it, and then that gets rid of the dots. Don't want the dots. And now if I go into my list items and then I change their display property, we'll set display inline, and we can see how now those items display in line. So this is part of how we can take a standard vertical list and make it become a horizontal. Again, we're playing with the display property, and that allows us to control how some of these things move around on our page. Now we have other options that we can work with, but the 2 most common are going to be display inline or block. Those are, and we do have inline block, which then has some different characteristics with it as well. So display is a good property that we can go through. Now if we want to take a block level element and we apply a width to it, we can center it by using the margin 0 auto, and then that centers it. So this centering technique does require the element to have a fixed width to it, so it requires us to know what that width is going to be. There are techniques that allow us to center anything on our page with CSS, centering it both vertically and horizontally, and some are more complex than others, but there's a lot of really cool things out there, and a quick search of how to center anything with CSS will reveal those kinds of things. So display is something that we care about as we are working with this and figuring out how to set things up. Box sizing is something that we have to take into account when we are trying to make sure that we know how our pages are going to display properly, because there are some things where margin values won't carry through. We have collapsing margins, and that causes some difficulty of getting specific layouts to occur. And shortly we are going to move to the more advanced techniques, which allow us to just abandon having to worry about all of this and construct our pages arguably in a much simpler manner. So this is what designers have had to do for a long time. So we have to use display, then we're going to have to look at what happens when we start positioning things. And positioning, we have static, we have relative, we have absolute. So we have these values that we can do, and they all adjust how the elements occur in our document flow. So that's the key thing we're thinking about, is the flow. Much like each letter flows one after another. But if we set position absolute on it, it pulls it out of that document flow and it puts it exactly where we specify it to be on our page. So we can set it with static or absolute positioning to control it. Now, if we absolutely position something in a parent that is relatively positioned, then it sits within that construct. If we don't have position set on the parent, then it absolutely will set it within the viewport, and then we can even set position fixed, and we can make fixed headers and footers that never move, such as the little yellow thing down in the corner. It has its display property set, its position property set to fixed, which is why now its parent is the viewport window or the body, so therefore it just sits there in that corner and doesn't budge no matter where we go on screen. So learning about using positioning, learning about using display, learning about using float, a lot of these things are going to have all kinds of weird gotchas. You try and lay out your page, you position something, you float it left, you float it right, and then we have to start figuring out, okay, wait, now I need to undo this, and now we have to use clear fix so that we have to then clear the floats, so we're no longer floating, so then we can get things to start going into a normal document flow again. Oh my gosh, this sucks. This becomes a huge, colossal, frustrating, pain in the butt opportunity to go, God, I wish there was something better. I wish we had some other option available to us instead of using floats and display and fixes and hacks, and then we go from browser to browser and it doesn't work. And then we can use where we set margins, we float things, so then we create this sense of visual overlap and it fits it on the page, and it's great for a standard size screen, but then we go to mobile and it blows up. And then we go to a tablet and it blows up. And then we design for mobile and it looks like junk and blows up on the desktop, and it just is maddening. You will lose sleep as you go through this, trying to get it to work, trying to figure all of these things out. And you think, gosh, if only someone would come up with something better. And then they did. Now we do have columns. It goes over this here on number 17. So we can do multi-column text, so the text is actually continuing into multi-column. That's a newer feature. New is a relative term, but it's a newish feature, and it's nice if you want to do a multi-column layout. You can make your text more readable than a super long line length. But then we move into things like Flexbox, which is, in essence, it's a one-dimensional grid. Flexbox allows us to take a number of elements, and it's like controlling that display property where we can decide, we want those elements to arrange themselves in a vertical or horizontal orientation. So we can make it standard blocks, like a standard display, but we could make those blocks also then display in a horizontal manner as well. So we could set the display to flex, and then we can move those things in a series of columns. We can set those columns of those elements up, and it works pretty good for arranging elements within a parent container. So flex is how we can control or arrange elements within that parent container. So it's like, just how do I want those pieces to move themselves around on screen? But what's better than flex is going to be grid. So let's get back to the beginning here. Grid. So grid is exactly that. So we can set up our page as a grid. And if we set up our page as a grid, we can decide how we want that grid to be broken down. So if we set it up as a grid, we can just say, hey, look, here now this thing is a grid. But then we can decide how we want those elements to be. So, hey, I can decide I want 3 columns equal sized. Boom, right there. But I could set columns at whatever size I want, or we can say we want it to be a fractional unit, which is super awesome. So I can just say 1, 1, 1, and it divides it into 3 equal parts. I could say 1, 2, 1, and then this would be, the 2 would be 50%, and then 25% and 25%. So we have a lot of flexibility. Or 2, 1, 1, we can mix, we can make one a specific size, a fixed pixel dimension, and the other is break it up into fractional units based on whatever the screen size is. So if we're predicting different screen sizes, whether it's a 900, 1200, 700, 400 pixel wide screen, we can figure it out. Now that allows us to really work when we start going into mobile development. Are we designing for a phone, a tablet, a desktop? How do we want that to occur? So working with this gives us a lot of flexibility, and we can even say I want it to be 3 columns, each one fractional unit, so we can use repeat instead of having to write it out. For 3 columns, well, that would have been easier just to write 1FR 3 times. But if you have more columns because you build a more complex grid design or layout, and as a designer you should really be thinking in terms of grid. How are you organizing or breaking down your page into grid units to have a harmony or elegance to your overall layout? Now, as we're working with the grid, the way to start thinking about it is we have these grid lines, and we can now specify how we want it to be broken down. So the first part is we break it down into a grid, and then we can decide elements, whether we want them to carry over. We want something to be, in this case, 3 columns wide, or 2 rows tall, 1 row tall. So we can specify that. We can specify where we want that element to show up. And we do that by needing to know these grid lines. Now it starts counting at 1. So in my 3-column grid, I have lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and in my 2-row grid, I have lines 1, 2, and 3. So we can see how that is broken down as we work with it. I have this little page here that I broke down and made, and what's interesting about this is this page really does encapsulate what, as web designers, we wanted and needed for years and years, which is I need to make a page where I have a header, I have a footer, I have multiple columns. I can get my background to completely fill those columns with whatever design, color, pattern, image that I want, so I can really control that layout, so I can build out that grid. Now I have these paragraphs occurring within it. Now if I go into this page, here it is. I set it up where I put everything into a parent container. I have that with the main tag, then I have a header in it, then I have the aside, I have the section with the 3 paragraphs, and I have a footer. So I have a basic page that I have now constructed. Now what we're doing with this is I'm setting up, so main, I set it up where it's a grid. And now if I look at here, we see some interesting things. Now I have 2 things going on here. I forgot to break this into 2 documents, so we'll go into it. We're going to look at the full width option here first. So you notice it says minimum width 700 pixels because I have this set up that if we switch and look at this with the mobile view and then get into a responsive view, we can see how it now changes its approach. So it no longer is, now I need to move the colors so the colors occur in both, so then it maintains the colors through all of it, and we'll do that in the example here. But I can see now when I switch sizes how that changes it. Now I'm just going to move this over because then that looks a little bit better. And so there's 800, and as soon as I cross that 700 pixel, it moves into what would be that mobile form. So let's move all of those up. Just going to, and let's just fix those so we get all of the color occurring properly. And let's see, so the section maintained its color, and I'll just pull that up into header because I forgot I was looking at the, when I added these in, I forgot which part of my style sheet I was working on versus what I was looking at. Bad form on my part. Save that. Okay. So, before, after. Okay. So we can see now, as our document changes, how these things are happening. So, I have a grid that I have set up, and my grid is a 2-column. So it's 2 columns, and it is going to then be 1, 2, 3 rows tall. So looking at my grid, well, again working with the desktop version first, the wider than 700. So it's 2 columns, each one is 1 fractional unit wide. And then I set my rows to 100 pixels, and I could change those if I want. I set a size, probably should change these, min width 700, 960, yeah, I probably should change that, but it's all good right now. Oh, fine. It's bothering me that it wasn't. Okay, so now we can see how our page is aligning up. So going back to these, remembering that we start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3. So that's how we count our grid. If I look at my grid here, so 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's important. So my header starts at line number 1, ends at line number 3. That makes the header become full width. The side starts at row 2, ends at row 5 as part of it, so we can see as things move their way down, our section starts at 2, ends at 5. Now that 5 is because we have put some other elements in there, namely those paragraphs, and then our footer gets our full columns of 1, 2, 3. So now what I can also do with this, and this is where it gets kind of fun, is I can even go and put a grid within a grid. So I can even put a grid within for the section, and we'll see that my paragraphs have effectively become columns because I now have another grid. So each paragraph gets dumped into each one of those columns. So as you build out your grid, you can build a grid within a grid to really finesse and control the layout of your page. So a grid is a 2-dimensional layout tool. Flexbox allows you to sequence the order of the elements. Now you can change the order they sequence. You can make them sequence vertically or horizontally. You can reverse their order, so you can take the last thing and list it first. So you have a lot of really crazy things you can do with it, and there's a number of great tools and sites online that help you learn Flexbox through interactive typing tutorials and they're super fun. Like Flexbox Zombie is one of my favorites. Highly recommended. Now when it comes to doing grid, it takes a little bit more work to gain the basic understanding of it. But a wonderful resource is a website called Grid by Example. Now we can see we have examples, we have patterns, we have resources, so we can start to learn how to do it. If I click on Start Here, we can see where we have videos, we have articles, lots of things we can go through and learn with it. If I want to understand these patterns, I can go look at the example and see how that example is going to work. So we have explicit and implicit grids, and now we can see here is the CSS, here's the HTML that made that, and here is the result. Now if you decided you wanted to change that, you certainly could. So you could play with it, you could change how you do it. So we could start playing with numbers and seeing what happens. So if I change that to, oh wait, I have to choose edit on CodePen and then I can do it. I forgot. I was thinking this was, the CodePen was editable right there, but it's not. So I'll go and change A, let's change that to 2 on here, and we can see how now that changed it. Now if I change that to 4, you can see again how it changes it. So the Grid by Example is a really good site that is going to give you lots of information on how to do these. You can look at the examples, you can look at patterns that pretty much have it ready to go, so you can play with that. Because this kind of concept of a header and a footer and a couple columns, I mean, this was, this was the holy grail of websites, of how do I build this with CSS, and using positioning and floats as a way to do it, and margins and other crap like that. And it looked great. You'd hop into a new browser and it'd blow up and you'd curse and scream, and it was just no fun. So Grid is really where it's at. And I'm going to encourage you to take a read through on something like Learn CSS Layout so you can understand some of those kind of predecessor technologies that we used. But what you really want to do is dive into learning how to set up Grid with it. Now, as you build your page and need to understand how to get it to position itself on the main screen, so you get your content there, Centering in CSS, the complete guide from CSS Tricks, is a great resource, and it goes into techniques on how to do all of it, so you can go and figure out, what's going to work best for your solution. So, hey, look, can I use Grid? All right, there we go, done. If it's fixed with an height or unknown, and the unknown one is nice. I'm a big fan of this one, where we do use the position relative, and then the child, we position that absolutely using a CSS transform. So we first change the top and left registration point to 50%, but then we go back 50%, so we don't even have to know how wide it is to be able to center something on screen. So we're using the CSS transform translate, works like a champ, super effective, highly recommended. Because vertical centering was really difficult for a long time. It's nice that we do have some techniques that we can do it. Grid does it too. So, Grid rocks. Highly recommended. So you can even go and find a website like howtocenterinCSS.com, and you just put, hey, what am I trying to do? Do I know how big it is or not? And then how do I want it centered? What support do I want? And it will give you code that you can copy and paste into your document. Then you just need to make the magic happen. So if we say it's an unknown height, unknown width, and I'm centering a div, guess I should have clicked on that first. So let's see, everything is, we'll say unknown, unknown, unknown. We want to center it left and put it in the middle vertically. And we'll say we only need the most recent IE. Hey, look at that. Flex. There we go. It says put it in here. And then we can make it work. So there you go. Some ways to work with what you're doing. Now back to this little thing about working with that media screen and min width, setting this up. So what I'm doing here is I am setting it up so that at a minimum width of 700, it displays with what's inside those curly braces. We can see that lines up with that curly brace. And it will first apply this CSS to all other situations, but then when it encounters this minimum width, it will do that. One hitch about doing that is you do need to make sure that you do have the meta tag viewport and width equals device width, initial scale equals 0. So you need to have some line like this. Forget to put this in because you don't use kind of a starter template or code completion to help you. So if you just type in HTML head blah 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 blah, which is great, but if you forget that line, you'll put in all of this stuff to try and do media screen and min widths and max widths and all kinds of fun stuff, and nothing works. And you're like scratching your head, pulling your hair out, cursing at your screen, frustrated, and then you go, oh bugger, I forgot that line. So if we jump over to W3 Schools, yet another great resource, we can see how we can go and set a few things. So we can set max width, we can set a min width, we can do different things and see how it changes it. So now if I am here and change, we can see how that browser window changes based on the width. So when we're really big, it's tan. Then we go to a smaller size, and then we go to an even smaller size. So this one is using, instead of min width, it's using max width. So it goes from big to small. The other option is you go from small to big. Both are acceptable ways of working. It's kind of how your brain is wired and how you want it to go. But you're simply doing your at media screen, and then at that breakpoint, so that's what we call these breakpoints, we put the properties we want to change. Properties that don't need to change, such as font designations, or if you want the colors to maintain their sameness, then you put those in, just you list all of that first. Then you start doing your specific breakpoints and whatever is changing, and that's where we will commonly be doing changes with our grid. So we change how we want the grid to be, or the fact that we don't really want a grid, or in this case, I'm using a grid, but it's just one column. So effectively, that's like not having a grid, except I did set a height property to make my rows of a specific height. And then at this minimum size, when it gets bigger, then I want to use all these other columns and change my layout. So that's the magic trick that's happening, is we're setting breakpoints. We're using at media screen to make magic happen. So the W3 Schools option gives us some good things. We can see how we may want to break it down. So it gives us a good example there. They have some nice information on the website about Flexbox, about grid. Read it. Read the responsive web design so you can understand even more about how you may want this to be incorporated into your web pages.